Please take your seats. I'd like to welcome you to the 21st Annual Slavic Bazaar through our department, the Russian and East European Studies Department. I'm Molly Pini, and I co-coordinate this conference with my colleague, Jamila Nazirova. For the first time, we are live streaming the conference, and that is why there are two microphones for the presenters. This one is going to YouTube, and this one is going to the room. We're going to have the presenters present in a row, and then we'll have a general question and answer session where we'd like the presenters to sit behind this table, and I will bring the YouTube microphone over there, and we'll have to repeat the questions for YouTube listeners. Our first panel has two presenters, Carolyn Vaziri, and Henry McDaniel, and the students usually present their own titles, so I will leave it up to them. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. My presentation is on the poem Poltava by Pushkin, and I wrote this in Professor Biar's class, so thank you for your guidance on this and for inspiring it. Before getting into the paper, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the focus of the poem. It is about the Battle of Poltava in 1709 between Tsar Peter I and King Charles XII of Sweden, who fought with Ivan Mazepa, a hetman from Ukraine. And in this battle, the Russian Empire defeats Sweden in just 3 months, ending Sweden's status as a hegemon in Northern Europe. And as a result of this, Russia really consolidates its power over Ukraine, and it's known as a very symbolic battle in Russian and Ukrainian history. And these are the main characters that I will be referencing in the poem. I mentioned before Tsar Peter I and King Charles XII, who Mazepa joins, but there's a level of both political betrayal and personal betrayal in the poem, as Mazepa betrays, allegedly, his friend Kochubey, who is the father of Maria, whom Mazepa eventually marries. Get right into it. In Poltava, Alexander Pushkin accounts the alleged betrayal of Ivan Mazepa, a hetman in modern-day Ukraine. Pushkin characterizes Mazepa as a callous, unapologetic character in his poem, emphasizing his deceitfulness, villainous tendencies, and old age in contrast to his youthful bride, Maria. Pushkin is not impartial in his characterizations of Mazepa. Mazepa is a clear antagonist in opposition to Peter the Great, the righteous, charismatic leader of the Russian Empire. In his poem Poltava, Pushkin presents an incongruence concerning how Mazepa is remembered. He alleges that Mazepa was long forgotten, but he also alludes to evidence that Mazepa captivated a large audience in Ukraine and unmistakably posed a challenge to the legitimacy of the Russian Empire. Pushkin also invokes Mazepa's own Ukrainian folk songs and incorporates elements of Ukrainian folklore into his poem. One could read Poltava as a celebration of Peter's triumph over the sinister rebel Mazepa and his ally King Charles XII of Sweden. However, at the analytical level, there is an inherent paradox at play regarding how Mazepa is preserved in Russian and Ukrainian memory. In the latter section of the poem, Pushkin makes a perplexing pivot in his characterization of the Battle of Poltava in the larger Ukrainian independence movement. While initially describing the mobilization as born from a long-awaited spark, Pushkin writes that the rebellious fervor was decisively abandoned and was erased from the hearts and minds of Ukrainians. Pushkin writes, quote, "100 years have passed, but what remains of these proud, powerful men imbued with all their willful passions? Their generation passed, and with them every bloody trace of effort, of failure, of victory vanished," unquote. Based on the previous descriptions of the movement, which this paper will outline, this characterization is contradictory. More details emerge which contribute to this incongruence. Pushkin writes, quote, "Mazepa had been long forgotten, only in a solemn, hallowed site, each year and to this day, in wrath a cathedral peals anathema on him," unquote. Unlike Mazepa, Pushkin writes, solely Peter was remembered for his sacrifice at Poltava, with a monument erected in his name. Pushkin's reflections on how the Ukrainian and Russian people remember the Battle of Poltava and the men who fought it are immensely puzzling. The people remember the hero, but they allegedly do not remember his foe. In the last stanza of Poltava, Pushkin presents his readers with another inconsistent assertion. Although he had just dismissed the possibilities of Mazeppa lingering in the memory of Ukrainians, he writes, quote, "And yet sometimes an old and blind Ukrainian rhapsodist, before the people of a village, strums the hetman's songs about a sinful maiden, and afterward the Cossack youths listen as he tells her tale." Pushkin therefore admits that the youths are still retelling the history of Mazeppa. It is informative to return to an earlier part of the poem, in which Kochubey shares his indignation over his daughter Maria learning the songs associated with Mazeppa. Quote, "Why, she had always sung those songs that he had fashioned years ago, when he'd been poor and unimportant, before his reputation bloomed," unquote. In this passage, Kochubey alludes to the songs crafted by Mazeppa and the national folk song sung in his honor. The translator, Ivan Eubanks, notes that these songs are still sung today. It is notable that Mazeppa may be remembered more for his art than his military leadership, exemplifying how art survives even through the most thorough acts of erasure and censorship. At the least, the reference to the rhapsodist and the songs which Mazeppa produced worked to undermine Mazeppa's earlier assertion concerning Mazeppa's quote-unquote vanished presence in the region. After the Battle of Poltava, Peter and subsequent rulers attempted to rewrite and reshape the historical narrative of the Cossack rebellion. Mazeppa's art and remembrance and song refutes the old saying that, quote, "history is written by the victors." Instead, another history is remembered through those who still sing it. As long as the people still pass down Mazeppa's art, one can never truly be expunged. Relatedly, N.V. Ismailov analyzes how Pushkin weaves in patterns of Ukrainian folk song into his narrative poem Poltava. Pushkin utilizes a combination of Ukrainian expressions, song-like narration, and lines reminiscent of a folk ballad. In Canto II, Pushkin writes, "You cannot hitch a trembling doe and horse up to a single carriage." In this scene, Kochubey is lamenting the loss of his daughter Maria, who is enraptured with Mazeppa. Pushkin borrows this expression from Ukrainian folklore to emphasize the plain incompatibility of the love match. Ismailov also notes that the beginning of Poltava is constructed in a song-like style, such as the, quote, "negative comparison expressing the agitated state of the bride Maria." He writes, quote, "Not a deer goes under the cliff, hearing the heavy wings of an eagle," unquote. Pushkin's use of elements of Ukrainian folk song draws more attention to the contradiction concerning Mazeppa and memory in Poltava. Pushkin not only references a Ukrainian Duma composed in honor of Mazeppa, but he incorporates Ukrainian folklore into his own narrative. This artistic choice allows Poltava to resonate more with the Ukrainian audience, which makes the memory of Mazeppa himself more accessible. On another level, Pushkin's text itself signifies the perseverance of oral tradition and folklore. It is revealing to interrogate the imperialist politics of memory, weighing the extent to which public monuments, as opposed to oral history and folk song, are conceptualized in memory and mobilize future generations. In the epilogue of the poem, the speaker says, "Only you, hero of Poltava, have built yourself a monument." While Mazeppa survives with a rhapsodist and oral tradition, Peter survives with a monument he built for himself. In the eyes of the Tsar, this monument marking his victory in Poltava may have been seen as a powerful assertion of his dominance over Ukraine. However, monuments may lack the enduring legacy of Mazeppa's songs and oral tales. A monument may be destroyed in the transition of an empire, while a song can be remembered and passed down among several lines of generations. Again, it is not convincing to conjecture that Mazeppa is unremembered. It is also helpful to examine the contrasting depictions of Mazeppa and Peter to enrich our understanding of their supposed contrasting legacies. Mazeppa is first introduced as the man who treacherously steals the heart of a beloved maiden of Ukraine, Maria. Maria's mother denounces Mazeppa as a shameless, ignominious man for his audacity to court her daughter. The hetman is also called incapacitated by young Cossacks. and the narrator decries his spite, deceitfulness, and cunning. The narrator continues writing that he has an unyielding soul, he likes to hurt his enemies, that never once has an affront in all his days escaped his grudge, that far away this haughty man has gained a criminal's dispute, that there is nothing he holds sacred, that there's no kindness he remembers, that there is nothing that he loves, that he'd spill blood as soon as water, that he despises liberty, that there's no motherland for him. Unquote. Mazeppa's list of offenses is revealing because it is a scathing caricature of the hetman. He likes to hurt his enemies implies that Mazeppa's revolt is more about a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate independence movement. Mazeppa's heartless willingness to spill blood, demonstrated in the latter half of this rebuke, insinuates that he would sooner sacrifice his own men than relinquish his quest for personal revenge. Additionally, the connotation that Mazeppa despises liberty seeks to undermine the ideological foundations of an independence movement such as that found in Ukraine. From the accounts of those around the hetman and the narrator himself, Mazeppa is rebuked as a villain of the utmost degree. Therefore, Mazeppa, in the reader's eyes, should be someone unworthy of songs or remembrance. Conversely, Peter the Great is described as someone entitled to commemoration. The narrator says, Peter's ingenuity was fueling Russia's growth. Later in the Poltava battle scene, he writes, quote, he quickly moves, magnificent, like bolts of lightning cast by God. Peter's holy vigor is juxtaposed to Mazeppa's serpentine, senile qualities. The dissimilarities between Mazeppa and Peter by Pushkin are overt. Poltava leverages the negative traits associated with Mazeppa's character and physical appearance to justify why many Ukrainians may not utter his name and story again. It is true that this distinction may be implicitly satirical. However, it is directly related to the discussion concerning Mazeppa in Ukrainian memory. Based on Poltava's tellings, Mazeppa was demonstrably capable of mobilizing popular support. This challenges the notion that Mazeppa would not be remembered by the Ukrainian people. The narrator writes, quote, the Ukraine quietly grew restless. A spark had spoldered there for years. The friends of old and bloody times were hoping for a people's war, unquote. The narrator also writes, quote, while their capricious lust awaited impatiently the might of Charles, they shouted rebelliously, it's time, it's time. Based on this description, Mazeppa was not leading a minority movement, but rather a mass movement. The youths were emboldened and had, quote, a rabid thirst for dangerous change, unquote. These details underscore the lasting extent of Mazeppa's legacy. Regardless of Pushkin's personal attitude toward the hetman, he emphasizes Mazeppa's appeal to the young men of Ukraine. Mazeppa was part of a popular insurgency, contributing to the idea that Poltava does not tell the story of a forgotten villain, but a recognizable face of Ukrainian resistance, controversial for some and celebrated for others. Further analysis of Pushkin's incongruent portrayal of Mazeppa's remembrance could be supported by following the historical developments following the Battle of Poltava. In his journal article titled Misunderstanding the Cossack Icon, historian Serhiy Pohi studies how the Russian Empire aggressively attempted to bury Mazeppa's memory. Pohi writes, quote, his name was anathematized in all the churches of the empire, and his portraits were banned and destroyed, unquote. Pohi describes how, in an investigation in the hetmanate nearly 30 years after Poltava, quote, icons bearing Mazeppa's image and portraits of him were systematically hunted down in Ukraine and destroyed long after Mazeppa's actual defecation, the end of the Northern War with Sweden, and the death of Emperor Peter himself, unquote. Despite these efforts to expunge Mazeppa from Ukrainian memory, he became a leading face of European Romanticism and inspired young Ukrainian national awakeners as, quote, a symbol of resistance to the Russian Empire on behalf of their beloved Ukraine, unquote. Images in literature depicting the heroism of Mazeppa, an alternate narration than that of Pushkin, were later repressed during the ascendancy of the Soviet Union due to his association with the separatist movement in Ukraine. Although there were efforts to eradicate Mazeppa in art, culture, and most of all, memory, it is apparent that these attempts were futile. It is no wonder, then, that Pushkin struggled to grapple with his characterization of Mazeppa. Ultimately, studying Russia and the Soviet Union's campaign of erasure against Mazeppa lends context as to why Pushkin is writing Poltava. It is important to recognize the inherent irony at play in Pushkin's Poltava. Pushkin characterizes Mazeppa as a hetman malevolent in nature and treasonous in his loyalties. Throughout the play, Pushkin points to the success with which he was able to mobilize a popular resistance movement and underscores the significant impact he had made on Ukrainian and Russian history through his role at Poltava. He also references Mazeppa's own artistic compositions and borrows from Ukrainian folk tradition. Even though the text argues that Mazeppa was forgotten, it works to perform a different mode of remembrance. People today, as many did in the 18th century, still present divergent narratives concerning the Battle of Poltava. Mazeppa's portrait, whether positive or negative, persists. 3 centuries later, Mazeppa is remembered in both artistic tradition and military history, but most powerfully by his people.
Is this good enough? Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. It's interesting to see how the memory of a topic of the early Romanov period connects so closely with that of the 1919 Ukrainian Revolution. My paper is entitled Mikhail Bulgakov's White Guard as a Narrative of Russian Imperialism. And I'm going to begin with a quote from the novel. Here in Russia, in our country, which is undoubtedly the most backward, the revolution has degenerated into a popular uprising of the worst sort. Thus, Mikhail Bulgakov unapologetically vexes in White Guard, a story of Kiev in late 1918, a time even more desperate and certainly more rudderless than the same city in 2023. 1918 saw Kiev not only facing the destruction of warfare caused by outside powers, but also a time of fracturing internal conflict. According to Yevgeny Dobrenko's introduction to the novel, it was set in a Ukraine damaged by World War I and engulfed in the Russian Civil War, with all of its confusion, violence, and chaos. Bulgakov relays the story over the few days encompassing Simon Petliura's seizure of Kiev. The novel is told from the perspective of the Turban family, a Russian intelligentsia family living in Kiev. The 3 Turban siblings represent the plight of the Russian intelligentsia amidst the revolution and civil war. More broadly, to justify the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that Ukrainian sovereignty does not exist and that Ukraine should be under the umbrella of Russian power and influence. White Guard illustrates that this argument is not new. Because White Guard is told from the perspective of members of the Russian intelligentsia, Bulgakov asserts a very narrow viewpoint, one that does not support Ukrainian nationalism or the creation of a Ukrainian state. Over 100 years later, these same nationalist ideals are being used to try and insert Ukraine into a Russian imperial space. Although White Guard is set amidst the Ukrainian Revolution, it is not a story of Ukrainian nationalism, but a narrative of Russian imperialism. This narrative of imperialism is illustrated by the negative portrayals of leaders striving for an independent Ukraine, the Turban family's monarchist views, the condemnation of the Ukrainian peasantry and working class, the glorification of the Tsarist autocracy, and the degradation of the Ukrainian language. The novel begins as Ukraine is under the hetmanate of Pavlo Skoropadsky. Skoropadsky, a former Tsarist general, was a conservative leader propped up by the Germans during their occupation of Ukraine from March to November in 1918. According to Serhiy Yakelchik in Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, Skoropadsky, who is often dismissed by historians as simply a German puppet, in fact represented the return to power of Ukraine's pre-revolutionary elites. Tsarist bureaucrats, military officials, landowners, industrialists, and urban upper middle classes. Despite their position of relative safety and prosperity under the hetmanate, simply because he is the leader of an independent Ukraine, the Turbans perceive the hetman to be an enemy of the Russian people. They ultimately longed for a return to the Tsarist autocracy, as demonstrated by their political opinions. Alexei Turbin condemns Hetman Skoropadsky at the dinner table, saying, "He's been mocking the Russian officers for 6 months, mocking us all. Who forbade the formation of a Russian army? The Hetman. Who terrorized the Russian population with this awful language, which doesn't even exist? The Hetman." Alexei Turbin perceives the Hetman as threatening Russian speakers within Ukraine. This perception is false, as according to Yakelchik, most of the Hetman's administrators did not speak Ukrainian, and many secretly favored the restoration of a Russian state that would include Ukraine. This is something that Turbins are staunchly opposed to. Although Ukraine, under the control of the Hetman, upholds the pre-revolutionary elites from the Tsarist period, it is far more conservative than the previous Ukrainian Rada. Any deviation from Ukraine being under the yoke of the Russian autocracy makes Alexei Turbin wary. Bulgakov cultivates how an imperialist narrative through the Turbin's pro-Russian viewpoints, which in part takes the form of opposition to the Ukrainian state controlled by the Hetman. Although Skoropadsky and Petliura are completely at odds with one another, because they are both movements that seek to establish a Ukraine independent from Russia, the Turbins distrust them. Therefore, neither side is viewed in a positive light by the Turbin family. Skoropadsky largely supported policies that actually aided the Russian intelligentsia in Ukraine, while Petliura led a grassroots movement spearheaded by the Ukrainian peasantry. Bulgakov characterizes Skoropadsky as cowardly during his portrayal of his flight from Kiev amidst its impending capture by Petliura's forces. Colonel Malashev, commander of the volunteer forces preparing to defend Kiev from Petliura, describes Skoropadsky's flight by saying, "The Hetman shamefully abandoned us all to the tyranny of fate. He fled like the supreme rat and coward he is." The circumstances of Skoropadsky's flight from Kiev are further described by Yakelchik. He writes, "On December 14th, the Germans abandoned Kiev. Leaving his abdication manifesto behind, Skoropadsky fled with them, disguised as a wounded German officer." Petliura's forces are portrayed as ruthless, merciless, barbaric warriors, while the predominantly Russian forces defending Kiev, whom Alexei and Nikolka Turbin volunteered to serve with, are portrayed as heroic and noble. The defense of Kiev from Petliura's forces illustrates the nature of the city as a stronghold of the Russian intelligentsia that does not want to be led by a Ukrainian nationalist who is primarily backed by the peasantry. Bulgakov's portrayal of the Hetman as a treacherous coward and the portrayal of Petliura's forces as barbaric makes Ukrainian leadership at this period seem chaotic and ineffective, contributing to the myth that Ukraine could not effectively govern itself and needed to be under Russian authority. With the collapse of the Russian Empire and Ukrainian independence at hand, Petliura took matters into his own hands and formed an army to seize Kiev. Bulgakov writes, "No one, not a soul, knew what this Petliura was trying to set up in Ukraine, but everyone knew for sure he was secretive and faceless and was hoping to conquer Ukraine, and in order to do so, he was on his way to capture the city." This ominous threat that Petliura poses to the power of the Russian intelligentsia is supported by the fact that Petliura's army is made up of Ukrainian peasants, whom Bulgakov consistently portrays negatively in White Guard. Heinous war crimes were indeed committed by all sides during the Russian and Ukrainian civil wars, but Bulgakov only describes the war crimes committed by Petliura's Ukrainian nationalist forces. According to Arthur Adams in The Bolsheviks in the Ukrainian Front in 1918 to 1919, Simon Petliura proclaimed a republican government, summoned the peasants to arms, and marched on Kiev. In the absence of any government, the peasants sacked villages and towns, and the operations of guerrilla bands added to the chaos. Horrific crimes were indeed committed by the Ukrainian peasantry. However, this was likely in response to crippling policies imposed onto them by the Hetman. Mark von Hagen writes in a companion to the Russian Revolution, "The opposition grew larger and more demanding after the Hetman pushed a new July 8th law for combating disruption of the rural economy that effectively placed the peasants at the service of the landowners with stiff jail sentences for any violators." Although Bulgakov criticizes the Hetman for terrorizing the Russian population, evidence suggests that he did much more to terrorize the Ukrainian peasantry. There is no mention of these punitive policies towards the peasantry in White Guard, only mentions of policies that allegedly negatively affected the Russian-speaking population. Just before Nikolka was attacked, Bulgakov writes, "Nikolka was frightened because he was utterly alone." This is symbolic of how Bulgakov portrays the turbans in the novel overall. Through passages like this, the reader is meant to sympathize with the members of the Russian intelligentsia like the turbans, who are facing loss of power amidst Ukrainian nationalist movements. In the late imperial period, there were efforts to help the Ukrainian peasantry by giving them greater control over the land which they worked. Faith Hillis writes in Children of Rus, Right Bank Ukraine in the Invention of a Russian Nation, that the newspaper Trud, Labor, considered the unofficial organ of the group in the early 1880s, praised Kiev-Lenin for its attention to the needs and desires of the Southwest peasantry, echoing the paper's calls for the expansion of local self-governance and the implementation of land credit and educational forms in the Southwest. Bulgakov provides no mention or insight into the plight of the peasantry amidst Russian land ownership, despite extensive activism among the Ukrainian press advocating for reform. Weikart is very one-sided in the way that the entire book is devoted to describing the perspective of the Russian intelligentsia, and fails to provide a counterpoint with the perspectives of other nationalities or classes. It is not a comprehensive description of the white forces in Ukraine as a whole, just a description of the pro-Tsarist ones. There is no humanization or sympathy of Ukrainian nationalism, only negative portrayals of its leaders and its peasants and worker masses. The pro-Tsarist sentiment among the Russophone professional classes of Kiev is not only evident in their political leanings, but is also evident in the reverence for physical objects relating to the Tsar, namely his portraits. As Petliura approaches the gates of Kiev, the forces volunteering to defend the city are assembled in the gymnasium of a Kievan military academy, where a huge portrait of Tsar Alexander I hangs. Malashev remarks, "The lights blazed on, reflecting faintly on Alexander's portrait. Malashev was so pleased that his lips parted and he turned to Turban. If that's not the damnedest thing, there's an officer for you." In White Guard, portraits of the Tsar are treated as animate objects, characters that play a role in the story instead of simply being figures of inspiration. As the Turban home is ransacked by three of Petliura's soldiers, a green lamp was burning in the study, and Alexander II, outraged to the depths of his iron soul, glanced at the three men. The treatment of Alexander II's portrait as an animate object in this scene not only represents how Bulgakov writes with a Russian imperialist lens, but also represents how the intelligentsia family unit was a key tool of Russian imperialism. Fabian Baumann writes, "Even with mass politics on the rise, the family could function as an organizational nucleus for political movements and an ideological model of a patriarchal nation. Families like the Turbans, the stalwarts of Russian imperialism, are the driving force behind Bulgakov's novel. By toasting the Tsar, I propose a toast to the health of his imperial majesty in saying, 'Only the monarchy can save Russia.' Alexei Turban illustrates how the intelligentsia family can be a breeding ground for pro-Tsarist political movements. Whether or not this perpetuation of old Russian imperialism is intentional, the Russian intelligentsia certainly feared losing the power they held under the Tsars, contributing to their fears of Ukrainian nationalism. The Turbans represent a kind of last stand against the onslaught of Ukrainian nationalism and socialism, a movement portrayed as unholy and barbaric. By having images of Imperial Russian leaders being the rallying point for the fight against Petliura, and having them be brought to life as validators for the pro-Russian cause, Bulgakov makes Ukrainian nationalism the main antagonist of this novel. The degradation of the Ukrainian language is another way in which White Guard is a narrative of Russian imperialism. The first instance in which the Ukrainian language is degraded is when Alexei criticizes the hetman for terrorizing the Russian population by allowing for the open use of Ukrainian. Alexei Turban describes Ukrainian as an awful language which doesn't even exist. Because the open use and publication of Ukrainian is a threat to Russian domination over the country, Turban feels threatened by the hetman. Upon Petliura's entrance into Kiev at the end of the novel, Alexei Turban witnesses a procession of the victorious soldiers. As he looks on with horror, a woman tells him, "The Moscow tongue has been banned," and he replies with, Aren't we allowed to speak our native Orthodox language? This is another example of the estrangement of the Ukrainian language and the uplifting of Russian. By describing Russian as native and Orthodox, Alexei is asserting his perspective that the language of Ukraine should be Russian and that any other tongue is foreign and illegitimate. Throughout the novel, the Turbans are victimized, and a key way Bulgakov does this is by twisting the Ukrainian language to seem like a tool of oppression instead of a desire to throw off the centuries-old Russian yoke. Bulgakov's perspective towards Ukraine outside the Russian-dominated cities is one of disdain. Evgeny Dobrenko writes, Ukraine in Bulgakov's world is the steppe, culturally barren, not creating anything, and only capable of barbarian destruction. Because the urban centers of 1918 Ukraine were majority Russian, Kiev is seen as a bastion of civilization and traditional values amidst a sea of unholy and volatile Ukrainians. The tensions in this novel, Russian versus Ukrainian, intelligentsia versus peasant, and city versus countryside, all contribute to White Guard as a novel that demonizes Ukrainian nationalism and victimizes the Russian intelligentsia, who are seen making noble and selfless sacrifices to defend Kiev from what is portrayed as a barbarian horde. The question remains, what prompted Bulgakov to publish White Guard in 1923, following the defeat of the Whites and the establishment of the Soviet Union? This book is a dissection of the decline of the Russian intelligentsia, done by discussing the life of a single family over a few days in war-torn Kiev. The pro-imperial rhetoric in this novel can be read as revisionist, a Russifying backlash amidst the politics of uplifting national minorities in the pre-Stalinist USSR. White Guard's legacy and that of Bulgakov have become increasingly complicated since Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. There have been calls to close the Bulgakov Museum in Kiev and to tear down monuments celebrating the author. Physical reminders of Russian domination of Ukraine are being phased out. As discussed in this paper, despite being set in Ukraine, White Guard is not a novel that uplifts or inspires Ukrainian nationalism. It glorifies the Russian intelligentsia and portrays them as standing nobly as the last bastions of civilization and reason before a tide of rural and peasant Ukrainian nationalism. Through the negative portrayal of Ukrainian leaders, pro-Tsarist sentiments, and the degradation of the Ukrainian language, White Guard is a masterfully deceptive work that legacy continues to cause controversy to this day. Questions of what constitutes Ukrainian sovereignty are key in the world forum, and White Guard serves to suppress Ukraine's right to nationhood. Thank you.
Questions? Have a seat. Any questions?
It doesn't seem that the current media coverage of the Ukraine-Russian war draw any attention to the long-term, centuries-old battles that always seems to be post-Stalinist diversions. Do you see any political attention to the history of the division between those two countries?
Could you repeat the question for the microphone?
Sure. The question was, do we see any modern political representation in the media of centuries-old tensions between Russia and Ukraine? Personally, I can't answer that, but I certainly think the debate is very much relevant within the tensions that erupted the Russo-Ukrainian War. And I think both of our papers remarked on that. And it's interesting to see the consistency throughout the entire Russian imperialist period, as well as the early Soviet period of that agenda, if you will.
I also am not a scholar of Russian or Ukrainian history, so I can't fully answer that question, but I was also curious about those roots, and I did find that the Ukrainian state media is using a patriotic song that references Mazeppa in the lyrics, so I thought that was interesting. I think there is some attention to key battles such as these, and it's still definitely lingering symbolically in the minds of many patriots and independence movements.
Really great papers. I enjoyed them very much. Both of you, through a poem and through a novel, had interesting points in your paper where you referenced material culture, one with a statue and one with a painting. And as we know, not just literature, but material culture and public art and private art too, often plays a role in presenting history. Do you see that happening nowadays? Do you see uses of Ukrainian material culture or Russian material culture in the Ukraine kind of being used for propaganda for the battle? For the president?
Can we repeat the question for the microphone? Sorry.
The question was whether both of our papers referenced material goods being used to sort of strengthen our respective independence movements that we studied. Are we seeing any material goods, such as statues, art, being used in the current war as sort of a propaganda campaign?
That's a great question. I certainly think that it's quite the opposite effect. As I described at the end of my paper, there are efforts to almost tear down the history of Bulgakov through reminders of material culture, such as the Bulgakov Museum in Kiev, as well as various statues and monuments devoted for him. So I think at this stage in time, Ukraine is making an effort to move away from those symbols of old Russian imperialism and reinsert their own cultural heritage within the geopolitical space.
I mentioned that the Soviet Union had this campaign where they were destroying icons or art referencing Mazeppa. So there was definitely that historically, but in terms, I'm not sure what's going on in Russia right now. But I do know that Putin has this narrative concerning Mazeppa. I can't really speak to it, but I think it's an interesting one that speaks to Russian imperialism. And I showed a picture of a Corvette that President Zelensky has just commissioned, and it's going to be released. And I think it's going to serve some function with the Ukrainian Navy. So, and it has Mazeppa's name on it. It's entitled after him. So I think that's another form of art being used to sort of speak to nationalism. I thought that was interesting.
To add on to that, the figure I described in my paper, Simon Petliura, is commonly remembered as a terrorist who committed heinous war crimes, which he effectively was, whereas Mazeppa is seen more as a heroic figure. But despite that, I think amidst this war, perspectives on Petliura are changing, and his memory is sort of being revisited, because immediately following the Ukrainian Revolution and Russian Civil War, this is the narrative that persisted throughout the Soviet Union, and for good reason. But amidst the ongoing war, there's certainly being a revisiting of the legacies of these figures. It's not quite related to material culture, but it's interesting to see how history can be used to serve different agendas, and how the revisiting of the legacies of historical figures can be reinterpreted.
Henry, question for you. You finished your paper with discussion of the context in which Bulgakov wrote this war, namely in 1925 Soviet Union, a project supposedly of peasants and workers
Yeah.
that is not only anti-nationalist but also anti-imperialist, at least on the level of its self-understanding. So what I'm wondering is if we separate these two levels of textual analysis on the one hand, and to what extent is historically accurate, it is of course a matter of debate whether we must ask literary works to be historically accurate. So I want to ask about specifically the literary level of Bulgakov, namely, how is it possible? Okay, it has an anti-nationalist statement, but how is it possible to write a book like this supposedly in support of autocracy at this time, in 1925? Right? Is there textually something else going on in this portrayal of class enemies or whatever of the current regime? Do you see these elements there?
Thank you. The question is if there are elements of in terms of separating Bulgakov's literary lens versus what versus his historical lens, and it's an interesting question. I think after Bulgakov published this novel in serialized form in 1925, he reworked it into a play called Days of the Turbans, which was famously um, quite appreciated by Stalin. And throughout the Stalinist period, Bulgakov was essentially protected under his regime and given a commission to write plays for the Moscow Arts Theater. However, with that being said, Bulgakov's work endured heavy censorship, and the themes that were described in many of his novels, especially Master and Margarita, are a clear indictment of the Soviet Union and its policies. White Guard is obviously extremely different, as Bulgakov's first novel. And I think because Bulgakov presents sort of a positive portrayal of the Russian intelligentsia, he's obviously not only asserting the fact that Ukraine should exist within a Russian imperial space, but he's also essentially carrying that legacy into the early Soviet period. And this is something I still have to research about how the legacy of the novel influenced, or if it influenced at all, Stalin's policies towards Ukraine. Is there anything else you'd like me to elaborate on?
We have about 1 minute if we want to have one more question, or we could end this panel here. All right, well, let's say thank you to our presenters. We have a 10-minute break until 10:25 when we'll start our next panel. Great job, you guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for
It's
having
fun.
to introduce our presenters, Ryan Hardy and Alexander Schreier. So please welcome. And the presenters will introduce their papers. Please, Ryan, you're first. Oops, one moment.
There should be a switch view. Can you find that?
Yeah, there should be switch view on the slides.
Do you have presenter view?
I do. This is presenter view.
I think it's in presenter view.
It's in presenter view.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Let's go back. Wait, how do we get there? I think like that. Okay.
That's good. Yep. Sorry, do you mind if I grab my notes really quickly? Because I don't have notes now on the slides. Yeah. No, that's okay. Yeah, I have them on my computer, so it should work just fine. All right, thank you for your patience. All right, thank you for coming today. I'm presenting my honors thesis, Lost in Space, Trapped in Memory, the Inter-Hopo Cooperative and Issues of Post-Soviet Collective Memory in Modern Bishkek. I wanted to give some context surrounding the Inter-Hopo Cooperative, starting first with some contextualization of early 1920s Pishpek, now known as Bishkek, later known as Frunze. I will refer to them all that way depending on the period. But Pishpek started as a smaller fort and commercial center in the 1400s. By the 1920s, it had grown to a yet larger commercial center, still under 20,000 people, and was not the Tsarist center of rule in Turkestan, where modern Kyrgyzstan now is. It had a smaller population, and in the 1920s, with the advent of Soviet rule in the region, there was a desire to establish a new regional capital for Bolshevik political control of the region. Further removed from the former Russian imperial center in Osh, and removed geographically from conflicts further westward with the Khiva and Bukhara Khanates in the 1920s, with opposition factions to Soviet rule. Following the 16th Party Congress and a call for international labor to the Soviet Union, particularly specialist labor, so those trained in trades and the mechanizations of particularly European industrialization, there was interest from leftist internationalists to migrate to the Soviet Union. Particularly in Central Asia, there was a demand for these specialist laborers because of the relative lack of industrialization compared to Western parts of the Soviet Union. In the Czechoslovak Republic, founded in 1918, internationalists and leftist factions followed this call to action, particularly in north central Slovakia. drawing particularly in this region from internationalists and speakers of the internationalist language Ido, also referred to as Reform Esperanto. There were many who, in this very ethnically plural region, who wanted to migrate to the Soviet Union to help heed this call for internationalist development, socialist development, particularly in regions that hadn't seen this industrialization prior. Starting in 1923 with the foundation of the Interhelpo Cooperative in leftist circles in Terchansky and Svati Martin in what is now north central Slovakia, we started to see transports of local residents who sold all of their personal property to save up pool funds and move to Pishpek. Like I said before, Interhelpo was part of a larger campaign to bolster industrial infrastructure following the expansion of Soviet rule into Central Asia in the early 1920s. The cooperative itself settled in western districts of Pishpek, now in the center of the city, but by then it was the outskirts of the city. And the cooperative itself contained a range of workshops, as well as residences, multilingual schools, recreational spaces, and cultural centers that were built out from the ground up, essentially, in the 1920s through the cooperative's liquidation in 1941. Interhelpo remained relatively autonomous in its operation for longer than many other cooperatives in the USSR, and only fell under total state ownership after its liquidation in 1941. Since then, material traces of Interhelpo have undergone a process of spatial change. First, as its industrial structures transitioned to the MV Frunze factory in the later Soviet period, and later in post-socialist transition of the urban space in Bishkek. In continuing processes of economic and structural change throughout the city, memory of the cooperative and the resulting nostalgia for its legacy from its legacy community have played strategic roles in supporting official narratives of interethnic cooperation, both in Soviet and post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan. These strategic deployments stray from a NEP-era 1920s internationalist conception of the cooperative as a vehicle of proletarian development, not just for Pishpek and its surrounding region, but for socialism as a whole. Today, memory of the cooperative continues to shape perceptions in Interhelpo's legacy community. And this is the subject of my research. I looked at the varying effects and interplay of historical narratives from not only official sources, so looking at academic historiographies, archived primary source correspondence, commemorative events, and state-sponsored exhibitions, but also individual narratives, community-based organizations, what they put out. So looking at personal archives from these families and community-based organizations, hearing the narratives of descendants from of the founders of this cooperative and those who grew up and worked in the Interhelpo district and its Soviet legacy community. I conducted 5 interviews over the span of 8 weeks, adding up to about 5 hours of audio that I then transcribed and analyzed through the context, through the lens of historical memory. So what is collective memory specifically? It looks at a smaller community, tries to see how memory affects their perceptions and identities of the present and past and their current identities. This is in contrast to public memory, which refers to a wider group within society and how more looking at a general public, for example, the entire population of Bishkek, as opposed to just those who grew up in this legacy community. So why collective memory? Historical framings are rigid. They seek to unify collective memory into a single narrative that prevails across time and space. Historical narratives can intentionally subvert the desires and needs of audiences, limiting the scope of remembrance to fit a teleological aim, or can themselves be limited by an absence of source inputs. The historicization of collective memory seeks to sum up and finalize periods that have already come to pass, putting an end to their stories and severing their connection to the present, or defining it narrowly in an instrumentalized fashion. Here, memory distances itself from the past, and it imagines and frames understandings of the present as radically different from those of the past. Collective memory is intensely autobiographical. It lends itself to impressions from those that are narrating it. It can draw from personal experience, but is also deeply influenced by shifting material, political, social, and economic realities, all of which influence how one might reflect on the past. In the rapidly developing economic space of post-Soviet Bishkek, political, nationalist, and generational pressures come to bear on collective memory. For smaller diasporas like Interhelpos, collective memory contrasts as those with living memory of the cooperative and the community it produced die or move away from Bishkek. In this sense, attempts to preserve collective memory of Interhelpo are inherently selective and limit the scope of broader understandings of the cooperative. I used the theoretical framings of Scribner, Charity Scribner, who frames post-socialist nostalgia in a spatial context, particularly looking at sites of collective labor, looking at shifts of labor to the private sector and how this fragments common industrial identity among workers. Then moving on to Svetlana Boyem, who looks at the socio-political effects of nostalgia and its effects on post-socialist societies. Looking at Interhelpo as a site of memory, I think it's helpful to look at the framing of socialism as a developmental track to a quote-unquote end of history, particularly as it's viewed by rather ardent followers of the socialist mission. Looking at this, we kind of see a idealized view of socialism and the material realities it can create. Sites of socialist labor are particularly important in this conceptualization of socialism in the post-Soviet period as physical manifestations of this idealism that stand as remnants of a Soviet past. The MV Frunze factory stands as a site of shared memory in this physical sense, looking at a unified socialist labor identity in the past, but still remaining in a more market economy present today. In terms of formal historiography of Interhelpo, there's been a marked decrease in institutional memory of the cooperative, particularly following the fall of the Soviet Union and the purchase of the Interhelpo district's state-owned entities, particularly a workshop called Kyrgyz Mebel, a furniture factory that housed all of the internal archives for the cooperative. In '92, renovations on the factory led to the disposal of all of the cooperative's internal records from those who collected them, and they were disposed of by the new owners. Relative inaccessibility of the remaining archives at the Kyrgyz National Archive have made it difficult for more popularized and accessible historiographies of the cooperative to emerge over the past 30 years. Most formal historiography and presentation of the cooperative in memory come from commemorative celebrations at a municipal level and national level, as well as museum exhibitions run by state museums in Bishkek. Most commemorative spaces and practices stem from community-based organizations like Nazdar, a societal union of Czechs at the Kyrgyz Ministry of Culture, and rely heavily on collective memory of the cooperative. Most members are the grandchildren of founding members of Interhelpo who moved to the cooperative from 1925 to 1932. These folks at Nazdar grew up in the Interhelpo district's Czechoslovak diaspora, mostly following liquidation. There are, from what I gathered from staff at Nazdar, no remaining people who really remember a pre-liquidation Interhelpo. But these diaspora members contribute to community historiography of the cooperative and create pamphlet series that detail Interhelpo's history from the perspective of its legacy community. As well, they also produce family biographies of founding membership. As a center for collective diasporic memory and leader of modern initiatives to preserve the history of Interhelpo, Nazdar grounds its narratives of the cooperative not just in yearning for cultural intimacy, for a simplified past, but also in a predisposition to nostalgic historiographies of the cooperative towards an idealized past narrative. Here, nostalgia plays a significant role in the formation of historical narratives as it provides a teleological point for of return for writers of history. In Histories of Interhelpo, these trends have changed over time, from those supporting ideas of unified Soviet people to under a labor identity, to more recent formations that attribute progress and meaning just to one or two ethno-national identities. I wanted to share this. It's a work permit granted to a family member of, or a founding member of the cooperative. Symbolic imagery within sites of memory can help institutions create historiographies that support their ideological goals. With Interhelpo, we see a general trend of sources supporting symbolic images that the cooperative foundation, the cooperative's foundation seeks to bolster, uses to bolster ethno-national representation of official historiographies. In the Soviet period following Interhelpo's liquidation, portrayals of the cooperative in historical sources focused more on displaying a narrative of socialist progress. Following Stalin's announcement that communism had been fully realized under the first five-year plan, the state carried forward the impetus of Korenizatsiya that categorized civilian populations into ethno-national groups and unified them in a shared supervening collective identity as Soviet workers under party leadership. This heightened attention to ethno-national subdivision of Soviet society marked a notable shift to individual identity from earlier Soviet conceptualizations of grassroots proletarian unity beyond individual sociocultural identity. While support for party-supervised national empowerment remained under Stalin, state-sponsored ethnic repression and Russification centralized decision-making power among those that could most easily adapt to an increasingly Russified Soviet culture. In the late Soviet period, identity-based tension mounted as dominant Russified culture became institutionally ossified, and passport nationality's symbolic role in party rhetoric remained static. In Interhelpo, we see this in a general, not restriction, but lessening of Czechoslovak ethno-national power within local party organizations and leadership within labor at Interhelpo. While Interhelpo receives the occasional nod in historiography through newspaper interviews, museum exhibitions, and commemorative programming from Bishkek city government, its internationalist foundations neither fit contemporary models of post-Soviet nationalism nor a history of neat ethno-national classifications from the Soviet past. It's too far removed geographically and ideologically from the modern Czech and Slovak republics and oriented too strongly towards internationalism to support national unity initiatives for a modern Kyrgyzstani public, or among those nostalgic for a Soviet past. Interhelpo occupies an awkward position in modern historiography in this sense. The cooperative falls outside of the full narrative control of any state and reflects internationalist ideology, now seemingly foreign after 70 years of socialist and post-socialist nation building in the region. In spaces like Interhelpo and its diasporas in Soviet and post-Soviet Bishkek, home is not a static place, but rather a dynamic one influenced by collective memory and reimagined through ethno-national identity to create a sense of belonging. In the absence of shared identity in a socialist industrial space, nationalism presents a political and ideological rallying point and contributes to a shrinking of experience, as outlined by Charity Scribner in her theoretical framings of collective memory, that holds the diaspora community together and mitigates feelings of alienization. I conducted interviews with volunteer coordinators at Nazdar, the granddaughter of one of Interhelpo's primary foundational organizers, a former factory worker at the Frunze factory, a descendant of cooperative members currently residing in the Interhelpo district, and the grandson of another founding member of Interhelpo, who contributes to the Nazdar archives. Conversations with this legacy community made it clear that the Frunze industrial, the MV Frunze industrial space and community played a significant role in forming the identity of a post-Soviet workforce and citizenry in the smaller community of the Interhelpo district. But late Soviet delineations of ethno-national identity and conceptions of proletarian unity continued to inform the memory of a Czechoslovak diaspora that stemmed from Interhelpo. To particularly the former factory worker, the presence and integration of Czechs in the post-Interhelpo industrial space spoke to the strength of Soviet society, as it supported workers from all backgrounds and nationalities, while post-Soviet ethno-national delineations to him seemed subversive, looking to undermine a broader sense of labor-based societal camaraderie. Members of the legacy community contrasted Interhelpo's internationalist development efforts with today's globalized economies. This was often coupled with a general distrust of Western cultural and market expansion into Bishkek since the fall of the Soviet Union. Ironically, it was these same correspondents who also characterized Bishkek's local Kyrgyz populations at the time of Interhelpo's foundation as primitive and noted the need for foreign specialist labor in the city's industrial development. For me, this raised questions on the imperial legacy of Tsarist rule in the Soviet industrialization of Central Asia as a whole, while Interhelpo did stem from a more grassroots and internationalist desire from its volunteers to build a more equitable society. Soviet portrayals of the cooperative carry a different historical burden of extractive Moscow rule. Lastly, in many legacy members, we see a desire for increased cooperation and mutual assistance with Russia, perhaps a conflation of today's Moscow as one of a Soviet past idealized in collective memory. Interhelpo complicates public memory. Its emergence stretches back to a Bishkek unrecognizable in today's Bishkek. Its foundational internationalist ideology and pluralistic ethno-national identity go against simplified ideas of centralized control over production and cultural life in the USSR. Its socialist mission and role in bolstering Bolshevik development in early Soviet Bishkek tie Interhelpo to Soviet rule, yet its nearly 15-year autonomy from fully centralized party planning mark it as a site of dissent in the 1930s Soviet labor structure. Interhelpo belongs to neither an overarching Soviet identity nor an ethno-national identity of one of the more than 17 nationalities that made up its membership. This trouble of classifying the cooperative under any one social, ethno-national, linguistic, economic, or organizational label is what exemplifies its importance in complicating the cultural dynamics of Soviet life and memory thereof. Through Interhelpo, we see the initiative of its founders, the motivation and progress of Soviet development, and the formation of a community unified in mutual assistance, or as Ido speakers would say, Interhelpo. Through the memory of its legacy community, the complexities of social change from Soviet life as they manifest in self-identification complicate perceptions of a wider post-Soviet society. This presentation is part of it's an adaptation of a larger project that digs deeper into spatial shifts and place-based nostalgia in post-socialist materiality of the Interhelpo district in today's Bishkek. This QR code will get you to the full text as well as the bibliography. I'd like to thank Kevin Platt, my research advisor for this project, as well as the international education team at Bishkek's American University of Central Asia, the team at NASDAR, the REES department, and all others that have made this project possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And now second presenter, Alexander.
Excuse me, could you come over and help? Is this like you need access? I don't know why.
Access to, did you log in?
Yeah, I logged into Google Slides.
So you need to just do it. I would just log into it wanted you to
Oh,
into your email.
like right here?
Yeah.
Oh, got it. We're in. All right, we're good.
You have to unmute the.
Unmute this and then. Okay.
No, we still can't see your slide.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's probably here.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Schreier, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm presenting my paper for my International Relations Research Methods class called Islands of Freedom and Seas of Autocracy. So the puzzle of my paper is based off of this map, which is a 2023 Freedom House's 2023 report on global freedom. And what I find really interesting is that, you know, we have a lot of continuity among not free countries, except in this area, which is kind of unusual because you have Russia and China, two very large autocratic countries, and we have Mongolia in between. And basically my question is, how can a country that's a lot smaller and has neighbors that are asymmetrically powerful and also authoritarian, how can this country remain a democratic country without the influence from these two other countries? So yeah, this is the question. It says, how does an island of freedom, which is what I call Mongolia, prevent its neighbors from diffusing authoritarianism without resorting to conflict in the matter of democratization? So how can Mongolia essentially preserve its democracy surrounded by these neighbors? So most of the existing literature highlights three important topics that have to do with this project. And one is on the neighborhood effect, one is on democratic sustainability, and the other is strategies for deterring aggressors. And the neighborhood effect essentially means that a country that is a larger country next to a smaller country should exert amount of soft power influence or just influence in general on the smaller country. And in the case of democratization, we'd expect that Russia and China would exert some sort of authoritarian influence on Mongolia, which we don't see. And also on the question of democratic sustainability, this project looks basically at how Mongolia is sustaining its democracy and what strategies it's using to do that. And we find three gaps in the literature. One is that most of the literature basically says that the neighborhood effect is too deterministic. It does not account for Mongolia. So some pieces that talk about the neighborhood effect basically say that Mongolia, in essence, should become an autocracy and does not highlight ways in which Mongolia could possibly be a democracy. And other pieces of literature discuss democratic sustainability does not account for external actors. So there's a piece by Snyder and Mansfield, which discuss ways in which democracies can preserve themselves. And it does not account, though, for external actors. It only accounts for internal measures to preserve their democracies. And finally, the literature discussing strategies for deterring aggressors does not discuss democratic sustainability. It only refers to ensuring state sovereignty. So I read some literature that talked about how Mongolia has been able to kind of balance Russia and China off each other. However, it does not talk about that in terms of democracy, which is what I'm more interested in. So what I end up creating is something called the third neighbor policy that I hope will be generalizable to other countries, possibly in post-Soviet space, but in the wider world. And in the third neighbor policy, which is actually named after Mongolia's third neighbor policy, there are three sub-policies in this theory. One is establishing good economic relations with both authoritarian neighbors and democratic counterparts. The other is remaining neutral on international controversial issues, and the other is increasing the country's global image through strong participation in multinational peacekeeping projects. And the two conditions that are necessary for this theory to work is that a country must be surrounded by asymmetrically powerful authoritarian neighbors and also possess some sort of civic nationalism. Because in that case, if a country has civic nationalism, it's not internal forces that are decreasing a country's democratization. It would only be external forces. So now what I create as a causal mechanism for the third neighbor policy to work is called the B effect. It's a little silly, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you put it all together. So basically, we as rational people would not kill a bee because it's smaller and it delivers a global public good, or just a public good in general, of pollination. So it would be unwise to kill the bee because it also has a stinger too. And we wouldn't, if we tried to kill the bee, it'd sting us, and that would just be so unnecessary because it's doing pollination, all this good stuff. And Mongolia is very similar because it's a smaller country, and it also possesses a military that it shows off in its UN peacekeeping forces, and it also delivers a global public good of just UN peacekeeping forces economic relations, and neutrality. So it's a very benevolent country. You wouldn't want to mess with Mongolia or interfere in it because it has it's just there. It's just delivering global public good and not really doing anything that would anger its neighbors. And so yeah, this is a little depiction of what would happen in the B case. But basically, the way this third neighbor policy works is that you start off with a democracy with asymmetrically powerful authoritarian neighbors and a democracy that possesses civic nationalism. And through these three sub-policies, the B effect, you achieve democratic sustainability. And if you're missing one of those sub-policies, what I call it, it creates a WASP effect, where instead of becoming a benevolent country, the country starts looking a little bit more aggressive, and that angers its neighbors. And what you end up seeing is an authoritarian neighborhood effect, where the larger country exerts some sort of negative authoritarian influence on the smaller democratic country. So in my research design, I use a comparative case study to compare Mongolia's neighborhood policy with Georgian neighborhood policy. And what I basically conclude is that Mongolia, following all three sub-policies of the third neighbor policy, achieves democratic sustainability, and Georgia follows only two of those sub-policies, missing one, which actually has contributed to a decrease in democratic sustainability. And today Georgia would either be called a hybrid democracy or an authoritarian state. And yeah, so moving into this, in the Mongolian case, what we see is that it follows all three cases of the third neighbor policy. So one, it has good economic relations with both the US, the EU, and also with Russia and China, who are some of its largest trading partners. It's also very neutral on regional issues. For example, one time Mongolia hosted the Dalai Lama, and that angered China a lot. And China actually placed sanctions on Mongolia. And what ended up happening was Mongolia sent away the Dalai Lama and released a public report that said that we would never, ever host the Dalai Lama ever again, which kind of pleased China and let them know that, they really don't want to mess with any of those two countries' internal affairs. And then finally, Mongolia is one of the largest UN peacekeeping, has one of the largest UN peacekeeping forces. And through all of this, it has contributed to what I would say is a really good freedom score, 84 out of 100. And Freedom House would call this a free country. So in the Georgian case, you see that under the first bucket of the third neighbor policy, it has good economic relations with both Russia and its other neighbors, and also with the EU in the wider West. And also, and right here, Georgia is also a really large contributor of UN peacekeeping forces, and it has contributed a lot in Afghanistan, and I think in the wider Middle East. But in the policy of remaining neutral on controversial regional issues, that's where Georgia has not followed the policy of the third neighbor policy, or the theory of the third neighbor policy. Because Georgia, in 2007, really expressed a keen interest to join NATO and to join the EU. And at the Bucharest summit, that was basically what was discussed in 2007. And in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And ever since, I don't think Georgia has been the same country. I think that Russia has exerted a lot of influence over its own democratic institutions through hybrid warfare, which would consist of information warfare, cyber warfare, etc. And that has weakened Georgia's democratic institutions, causing it to be a partly free country. So what is the conclusion, and how do we wrap this all up? So basically, I conclude that democracies that are surrounded by asymmetrically powerful authoritarian neighbors face a threat to their democratic systems from the neighborhood effect. But to counter this, islands of freedom implement the third neighbor policy, which increases the B effect and achieves democratic sustainability. Basically, basically countries that are smaller should try to achieve some sort of global public good and position themselves as benevolent, and also try to show off their military in ways that make other countries question trying to interfere with their democratic institutions. And the US can learn from this by not interfering with regional power dynamics when promoting democracy abroad, basically providing what I call spatial insurance to larger authoritarian neighbors that that these countries or that the US will not try to, create some sort of realignment in the region, which might anger larger regional neighbors. And future research can look at how islands of freedom who have an asymmetrical power advantage relative to their authoritarian neighbors achieve democratic sustainability. So if you look at the map that I have highlighted, cases of this include Ghana and include Israel, which I have not looked at, but these countries possess a asymmetrically powerful power advantage over their neighbors, but they're also islands of freedom in that case too. And that was what future research could possibly look at. But with that, yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you. So now we have time for questions. I would ask the presenters to briefly rephrase and repeat the questions for the microphone. You don't need to lean into it, just.
So I have a question for each presenter. So for Ryan Hardy, I was just interested in getting some basic data, if you have it, about just when the Czech or other interhelpo. I think you focus only on Czech mainly.
It's both. It's Czechoslovak.
So,
Yeah.
Czechoslovak, but when did they come? Like, how many of them were there? What happened to them during the Stalin period, right? And how many kind of remain, or even what their feeling is about. Like, there were a number of things that were just like factual things that maybe were difficult to get because of lack of archives. Perhaps. I just thought that was a question I had.
So the question was on looking at like numbers and data of the cooperative, particularly in those who migrated, those who remained, the demographics of Czechs and Slovaks and Czechoslovaks in general. I'm going to use the term Czechoslovak because I think it's a little bit broader and more encompassing of the ethnic plurality within the First Republic Czechoslovakia, and its trajectory over the course of the history of Interhelpo and its legacy communities. So I can say I wrote out a detailed historiography that I couldn't include. The thesis itself was 90 pages and I condensed it into 15 minutes of presentation. So the first chapter is a 30-page historiography in English. It's probably the longest one published right now. But I would say it was around 1,800 migrants to Interhelpo from 1925 to 1932. In the early stages of migration, there were a bunch of people who got to Píšťek and looked around and said, this was not what I expected, and turned around and went home. There were a lot of people who were stranded there because they'd sold all of their property. So, and particularly looking at the first transport, you had high mortality rates, particularly among children, because of relative lack of medical infrastructure in Píšťek. And you didn't have doctors arrive until the second transport 8 months after the first. Looking in the 30s, as you saw more state centralization of the cooperative, you also saw more reverse immigration of founding members of the cooperative back to Czechoslovakia. But they were rather influential in the formation of leftist circles in Czechoslovakia, particularly after World War II. So looking at Alexander Dubček, who was a president of the Czechoslovak Republic in the communist period of Czechoslovakia. He grew up from ages 6 to 10 or 12 in Interhelpo. And there was a lot of exchange of journalists, political theorists, novelists who passed through to do reportage in the region. Now there are about 30 remaining families of Czechoslovaks in the legacy community in Píšťek, or in Bishkek. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. But it's all in the paper if you want to give it a read.
And I had a question for us. so if your formulation of the B hypothesis or democracy is sustained, but from your example about the Tibet, the Dalai Lama, it seems like maybe sovereignty is sort of weakened, right? So I just wonder that is there a price that's being paid by Mongolia in terms of its sovereignty over by basically trying to accommodate the interests of both Russia and China?
I would say.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah. The question is whether Mongolia has to pay a price of its sovereignty over following the third neighbor policy. Yeah. I would say yes. I think that they do, and I think that's there's only a few ways forward for Mongolia when you're trapped in between of two countries that exert some sort of authoritarian neighborhood effect influence on them. And I feel like the way forward for them has shown to be, really being careful on what they say, on what they do to try to please their neighbors and position themselves as benevolent.
I have a question for Ryan. Thank you for your phenomenal presentation. This is a really phenomenal archive and existing community that it's amazing that you've been able to work intergenerationally. One of the most amazing things about this archive and this history is when it's taking place during history, the 20s are an incredibly chaotic time, to say the least, with the legacy of World War I heavy on the minds, especially in Central Europe. And so first, I'm curious about the way in which the kind of psychic destruction that was experienced through so much of Europe and the need to build new worlds is reflected in the archive. And second, on this idea of building new worlds, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about settler colonialism, and if you do consider this a settler colonial project, and to what degrees it fits within a larger history of Soviet settler colonialism.
Yeah. So the first question was looking at the legacy of post-World War I political dynamics, social dynamics in Central Europe and its effect on the need to build new worlds, kind of thoughts internally in Central Europe. I'm going to tackle that question first, and then I'll get to your second question. So I will say that in my work looking at like the social environment, political environment in Central Europe during this period, particularly in Czechoslovakia and the First Republic, there was a shift towards looking at how you could make a more egalitarian system in terms of distribution of resources and distribution of land, particularly. There were land reforms in the late teens, early 20s that looked to dissolve a lot of the estates. None of them were fully realized for the most part. There was very little actual change, but I think there was a lot of frustration, particularly among agrarian communities in Czechoslovakia, looking particularly at Slovakia, which has historically had less resources and less wealth than the Czech lands. So I think here we might see like that's where kind of Interhelpo plays into it. You have a lot of people who are leaning into the desire to see social change, kind of a lack of upward mobility socially, economically, and a desire for more. The founder of Interhelpo was actually, so Rudolf Pavlovich Maracek was in the Russian Empire during World War I in Almaty, writing in Edo and internationalist newspapers, and then moved back to Czechoslovakia. So that was kind of like the catalyst in terms of leadership for that. In terms of the second question was looking at settler colonialism and how Interhelpo might be characterized in the lens of Russian and Soviet imperialism as a settler colonialist project. I think that's a really good question, and that's something that I kind of rubbed up against throughout my ruminations on Interhelpo. I think that particularly looking at as it's remembered today, regardless of how internationalist the project was in its foundations and theoretical framing, there's a lot to be said about a group coming to settle and quote unquote develop a region. In terms of, I'd say it's part of a larger Soviet project to exert, to kind of create like an extractive economy, something that can put out resources. Again, it was all under Moscow rule for the majority of Interhelpo and its legacy industrial communities history. But I think that when you're looking at the numbers in terms of membership of Interhelpo, it transitioned rather quickly from a majority Czechoslovak migrant population to either those displaced by like Soviet deportations in the 30s working in the industrial community, or local Kyrgyz, local Dungan, local Uyghur populations, Kazakh populations, Uzbek populations that were working in the community as well. I think looking at Frunze, so later what was Frunze is now Bishkek, you definitely saw a massive amount of Russian like immigration to the city, and I think you can't really ignore that in terms of the power dynamic it implied, specifically with the Russification of Soviet power structures.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
No. But I had one question for each. Would that be all right? That's fine. I had a question about, do you have an example of the wasp analogy, a concrete example? What happens when?
Yes. So the Georgian oh yeah, we're fine. Do you have an example of the wasp? Yeah, but the wasp effect in action. Yes, the Georgian case was the example of the wasp effect.
You had a global map, so I was wondering
If there were any other examples.
that's fine. I'm just
Yeah, I don't think I do. Well, off the top of my head, but if I looked, maybe.
For Ryan, could you share some background on the interviewees that you met?
Yeah, the question was some background on the interviewees that I met. So I met most of the people. A professor I had this summer had a contact at the community organization that I was doing. It was like my home base for the interviews. The woman who staffs the diaspora office is actually not herself a like legacy member, but she's just somebody who's really passionate. She worked in like Soviet like labor unions, particularly in factories, and is just like very, very passionate about the legacy community of Interhelpo, and knows all of the legacy members. So most of the people I interviewed were 60 years old or older. The person who supplied me with the picture of the document I had, the very old document, was the youngest interviewee I had. He was probably about 60. And I think as you looked at younger interviewees, you saw more of a desire to interact with like modern day Czech Republic, Slovak Republic. His daughter actually migrated to Slovakia immigrated to Slovakia in like 2010, now lives in Prague, has a family there. And there's like a more of a desire among younger legacy members to get dual citizenship, interact with that part of their history, as opposed with to a more Soviet labor identity. Yeah. Thank you.
Let's reconvene. We're about 10 minutes behind. So let's reconvene at 11:30 for the keynote. our keynote speaker, who is Alex Roit from the History Department here at University of Pennsylvania. He's a graduate student, and I'll have him take it away.
Thank you. So yeah, my name is Alex Roit. I'm a sixth year in the PhD in the History Department at Penn, studying Soviet economic history. I want to first of all thank all the organizers for inviting me to give this talk, and also the panelists for sharing their wonderful research today. So my talk is the Capitalism with Soviet Characteristics, Evidence on Financial History of Stalinism. Capitalism with Soviet Characteristics is also the name of my dissertation, so I kind of was not as creative there as I'd like to be. But nevertheless, that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to give a brief just outline of what I'll be talking about in my talk. General interest and direction of my dissertation research, how I got to studying Soviet finance, which is a kind of a slightly esoteric topic, even in Soviet economic history. Then very briefly sum up the historians with whom I'm in conversation, who I'm arguing with or against. And then I'd like to give a short illustration of how Soviet finance kind of worked according to the research that I've done and the archive research that I've done, and specifically how the Soviet economy operated with what I call a quasi-capitalist mechanism in the 1930s, when it was supposed to be a planned economy, essentially planned economy. So that's kind of a tease there, but we'll get there sooner. So in general, the question or the relationship that I'm interested in is the relationship between Stalinism as a kind of system, a political economic system, and capitalism, which is broadly also a kind of social economic system. Now, from the point of view of sort of historical consensus, it's pretty obvious that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was hostile to international capital in terms of its ideology, its cultural outlook. It was also anti-capitalist in practice. Obviously, when Stalin came to power, or once he really took hold of power, he launched what is called the Second Socialist Offensive in 1928-29, which on the one hand was a break with the previous regime, which was New Economic Policy, which was launched by Lenin, a kind of, again, quasi-capitalist, state capitalist restoration. The use of markets was allowed for a brief period of time. And Stalin came and broke with that, I won't say tradition, but that policy, and instituted collectivization and industrialization on a mass scale, urbanization into the cities, obviously construction. And so on that level, it's hard to argue that this was not a rupture. But I was sort of always been interested, since I was an undergrad, in whether this was actually kind of achieved, whether the ideological level or the rhetoric wasn't hiding deeper continuities with the previous NEP practices that had been allowed under Lenin or under the what was then a collective kind of leadership in the Bolshevik Party. And so, I mean, on the level of ideology, of course, this is a poster from the collectivization campaign in 28. At the end of the 5-year plan, it says their collectivization will be completed. And the idea being that, of course, collectivization will generate enough surplus to funnel into the cities and into industry and finance a huge leap into the future, be it socialist or industrial, whatnot. So, so what historiography can I kind of lean up against or argue with? One of the ways that in which this rupture continuity dynamic could be interpreted is through money, through the study of Soviet finance and Soviet money. And recently, there's been a slight boom, a kind of cottage industry about Soviet money and Soviet finance. Scholars have begun to analyze money as a kind of tool for building socialism. Now, what I mean by socialism is broadly a moral idea of socialism, right? Fairness, kind of an egalitarian system, essentially planned system, but also money as a kind of representation of social trust. As a kind of trust, a social contract, if you will, between the narod, the people, and the state. And what that involves in brief would be sort of fairness, workers' compensation, but also trust in the larger sense of trust in the socialist mission And some of the work I list there, I won't go too deep into that work, but they speak to sort of this sort of political cultural approach to money as a kind of social institution. A lot of this work is based on sources from what you can call the technical intelligentsia. So economists, policymakers, bureaucrats, party cadres who focus on, who emphasize in their own writings a kind of socialist character to finance in the Soviet Union. So all the same themes that I talk about here are sort of replicated in the evidence of these sort of intelligentsia, the people who actually supposedly govern the financial system or govern the way that money works. But what I find is, and this is no slight against this literature, which is fantastic, but the focus is often a kind of a narrow focus on money as, you know, cash, savings, workers' bonds, sort of the most liquid form of money that you have, where people use to consume products or pay for rent, whatever. So it, of course, it ties back to that idea of the relationship between the people and the state. The state provides compensation for the labor, and the labor goes out and does what it needs to do with that money. But in general, in history, and across both socialist, capitalist systems, most money is not cash. It's either debt or, in many cases, equity also. But for the most part in history, it's been really forms of debt that have constituted the large facet of the money supply. And so for me, my brain got to thinking about, well, where is the debt in this economy? It sort of seems like a debtless economy where there's nothing going on, but there are, of course, loans and ways to finance trade and industry through debt. And so this put me on a wild goose chase, as it often does with dissertation research. And so what I came to discover through reading other historiography and doing archival research is that for the most part in the 18th and early 19th century, debt was primarily the form of money, and it was exchanged and traded in places like this, or created in places like this. So this is two images of the Moscow Stock Exchange, or you could call it also the Mercantile Exchange, to be more precise, but I call it the Stock Exchange for ease. And this was the place, one of the places in the Russian Empire where merchants came to mobilize capital, basically to finance their trade, finance investment much more later on, once you had really enterprises and businesses going to the stock exchange to finance their own investments in their equipment so that they can generate some kind of capital to expand. And the question that arose for me is, well, if these existed for up until February 1930, and then in February 1930, Stalin banned them. It's kind of a little studied decree, but he banned stock exchanges, or the government banned stock exchanges and mercantile exchanges. And suddenly there's no securities market, and most stuff exchanged on the stock exchange are securities in some form of debt security. So the question arose for me, well, where did that go? Where did all that stuff? Did it just really vanish overnight? And I studied also what kind of securities that there were that were often used, that were often exchanged. And the most prominent is something that is known as the Bill of Exchange. Now, in European financial history, this is a quite well-known financial instrument. It's a negotiable, marketable security that's used not only in the Soviet system, but across Europe. And its earliest appearance in Russia is sometime in the 15th century, when Novgorod was trading with the German Hansa, the Hanseatic League. And so the actual word for a bill of exchange in Russian is veksel, which is a German loan word for exchange or trade, turnover, something like that. So the bill of exchange in Russia was often used not only for financing trade, but actually as a kind of a loan. So people would sell a bill of exchange to someone for cash, and then would say, in 90 days, I will pay back this amount of money. And usually would give a security interest, which is like a collateral, saying, if I don't pay it back at this percent at this time, then you can confiscate, or you can take some collateral, maybe land, maybe equipment, maybe something. So, so it was often used as a kind of loan. But this is also part the case with Europe, because in Europe, the Bill of Exchange was famous for being one of the ways that you could loan people money and charge interest while avoiding the sort of Catholic prohibition on no interest payments and stuff like that. So, and this made the Bill of Exchange an early type of security. Once these bills became traded on the stock exchange, so as I said, people promised to pay out a percentage of interest over a course of a short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 months. And if they did not, they underwent a kind of bankruptcy and in quote unquote, and their collateral would be confiscated through courts. There would be litigation. Obviously, it's not as simple as I say here, but people would maybe come to collect, or they could sell off a bill and collect and have somebody else collect it that way. So this is an example of a bill of exchange, the kind of simplest form of one from 1928, which I found oddly enough on the Russian auction website. So sometimes the archive could be anywhere, basically. And it's a bill between two, what I take is to be two party officials, or I'm not sure actually the first person, Yuri Vorobyov, I'm not sure whether they are a party official, but it strikes me that they are. And so one person here is selling a bill to somebody else for some amount of cash that is not specified. And then on the back is the endorsement of the bill once it's been paid off by that person that drew the bill. So saying that, that money, I received it, and they paid it in full, so everything's great. So there was a loan, and then it's a short-term loan that was cleared sometime in the course of a couple of months. So interesting, though, is that the Communist Party members are using this kind of a loan system, which struck me as interesting because I'd never heard of something like that, where a communist cadre would be lending money and changing money that way. So again, the goose chase continued. I was interested in knowing where most of those went after 1928. And during the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to go to Russia. I'd been to Russia to do research before that, but obviously then the pandemic and then the war made it very difficult. But I found basically a way to look at the Central Bank of Russia archives, which oddly enough were just out in the open for no one to care about on the internet. And they were sitting there, and I said, okay, I'm going to just start reading them. And I suppose that they are published for researchers to use, but they're kind of hidden in an odd place on the website. So I started to look, and I found in the conversations of the chairman, or the sort of the board of the state bank, which is Gosbank, the state bank of the Soviet Union, a kind of interesting moment. So in 1939, this is after the mass executions, the terror has already happened in large degree. The Minister of Finance, Bulganin, at that time, spoke in a closed session of the Collegium, which is the chairman of the Gosbank, about the problem of a kind of shadow bank sector that had formed in the Soviet Union. And he says, there's the issue of overdue debts, not so much to the bank, meaning the state bank, as between economic agencies. It reaches more than 5 billion rubles. This means that a second bank has been illegally formed in our national economy. Our people's commissariats owe 5 billion to each other, and for several years now, we have not taken any measures. That's not really true, but we'll table that. A very serious fact. Firstly, this is bypassing the state bank. They give loans to each other. They owe each other. It would be half the trouble, but it will disorganize the national economy and the credit plan. And I immediately drew attention to the fact that these questions were bypassed and are known, meaning they didn't discuss them. And there's probably a good reason why they wouldn't want to discuss it, because this doesn't sound like socialism. It sounds a little bit like when they use a term like the second bank, when Bulganin says second bank, that's a bit of a misnomer, because obviously there are loans, there are debts being traded, but they're being traded as securities. So it's not as if there's another place called the second bank and you go over there and you get money. It's an amorphous term for really what is an underground securities market that is exchanging money hand to hand. So this is not only a very serious problem for the bank, it's a very serious problem for the ideology, because this is technically not supposed to be happening in the second 5-year plan or the third 5-year plan. by the time when the transition to socialism is supposedly already either completed or about to be completed. So this led me again into uncharted waters. I had to search out for some place where I can verify what this actually looks like. What does it mean to trade security? What does it mean to have a second bank? And it led me to more local archives, St. Petersburg Central State Historical Archive, where I started to investigate a prominent factory called the Kirov plant, which I'll say more about. It used to be the Patilov Works, then it became the Kirov factory. It's still operative today, produces tanks and tractors and all kinds of things. And I looked at files with this plant because this plant had documents related to large cases of fraud and sort of market-style corruption right during the years of the terror. And I thought, okay, well, that piques my interest. So this is discussions with the head accountant, Bugalter, of the Kirov plant, by the interrogator, who is what is called a commissioner of Soviet control, sort of like an investigator. I won't say interrogator, I'd say investigator of fraud and corruption, but subordinated to the secret police unofficially. There's like a subordination chain. And so they're trying to find out what the hell is a second bank. How does that work? Which is topic of discussion. So the Kirov plant, which you see here in Leningrad in 1937, basically to summarize, the way that the securities trade works is kind of half fraudulent and half not fraudulent. Obviously, you can have securities fraud without stocks or shares, because usually people will go insider trading or equities being traded. But it's actually debt that's being traded. You have these marketable securities, the bill of exchange. And what is happening is if a firm like the Kirov plant, you have to remember this is 1936. The Kirov plant is an armaments plant, a defense plant. So it's massive. It's one of the biggest plants, one of the leading plants in the Soviet economy, tank production, armament production, ammunition. Think of the resources that it has to buy from other plants to create, and then also how much it's contracting it's doing with the defense, what it called the Commissariat of War, but it's really a mobilization directorate or something like that. I forget the real name. So big plant. And so it has a lot of working capital to spare due to its size. It gets a lot of credit from the state bank. And it could sell that working capital to firms who don't have it, who maybe have a credit limit, for a short-term cash payment. So you go to the 25 people every day go to Kirov plant, what are called bill brokers or pushers, and they represent a second firm. The firm purchases a bill from the Kirov plant. It says, here's, I don't know, $10, not $10, but like, here's $1 million. And I need a $10 million bill of exchange, ruble, sorry, dollar. Bill of exchange. It opens a contract with the trust so it looks official. And the trust promises to pay the 10 million over a course of a certain maturity time. So what the smaller firm does, it goes back to its office, and it counts this bill that it's received from the big trust as revenue, which is kind of, a kind of accounting fraud in a way, because it's not yet revenue, it doesn't exist yet, but technically it is, because it's receiving this money and it's increasing its own working capital. So then it goes to the bank and says, hey, look, we're growing, we're profitable, we're getting a lot of revenue. And this is what the state bank calls double lending, which is you're making money out of money. There's nothing has been produced yet, but you've made money twice, basically, out of nothing. And so the fraud part of it comes with the fact that the bill that has been bought from the Kirov plant never clears. And it never pays out the 10 million. It just, kind of time runs out and people forget about it. So there's money being made without it ever being produced into cash and then being paid out. So that's the fraud part. The security is actually a fictitious security. So before I get to the fictitious part, this is the head of sales department of the factory. This is the sales bureau in the factory. There's different departments. And he says that the factory's accumulated several thousands of rubles of income a day utilizing this type of fraud, income which according to the law should have gone to the bank. And Germais, which is his name, said that the factory's court received cash that is not shown to the bank, which they did not surrender over. And according to the rules, all cash receipts must somehow go to the bank. Getting ahead of myself. Yeah, so when asked by the commissioner of Soviet control whether these are significant millions, the head of the sales department says large in the millions. So obviously that gets flagged. The commission finds that despite the unevenness of output, so low sales, very low quality goods being produced by the plant, it releases tanks, but these tanks get to the place that they're supposed to be at, and people go, there's holes in the tank, there's a bolts missing and whatever. The working capital of the firm at the end of the year is approximately, this is 1937, 145 million, in excess of 50 million. So where does that working capital go to? The commission goes to the bank branch at Leningrad and says, what the hell? And they go, the excess balance, they give some kind of explanation, but they say there are deviations from the plan. We don't really know, but these deviations are liabilities. So the plan is loaning out money somehow, but it includes accumulated surplus profits resulting from differences of actual costs and estimated prices, excess balance to creditors, and disputed funds, which is, you can go into each one of those and have a whole chapter on them, which I do. But the point I want to drive is weird stuff is happening at the Kirov plant, which is related to the second bank thing. So the other thing I want to say before I move on is the question of the fictitiousness of these bills. So after Stalin bans the stock exchange, the bill of exchange, it has this function of a security. It takes on this function again, and it represents kind of a piece of the working capital that's being loaned out from the Soviet enterprise. But the face value of a bill, whatever you write on the bill, is kind of fictitious. I mean, it's measured in the total value of goods in terms of the plan price. So whatever the plan says a tank is supposed to cost or a resource is supposed to cost, and then you calculate that and you loan it out. But those prices are controlled prices. They're not market prices. So you can sort of come up with stuff and then lend it out through that. And the bill itself is not backed by anything. So it could be, the goods could be inferior. They could be incomplete. They could not exist. But the contract is open and the bill is signed. So it's kind of a counterfeit security in that sense, because both the price and the money that's being calculated and the goods are all kind of fictitious. And there's a bigger debate I can go into about whether the plan itself is a kind of fictitious thing, which people have argued, but that kind of actually relates to that point. And so the loan is a loan that is not backed by anything. It's just capital making capital in that sense. Kind of quick, I guess. Okay. I might end early, so we'll have more time for questions. But basically, the conclusion that I've come to just from studying these kind of case studies, which is mostly what I do in my dissertation, is three things. The first thing is that Stalinism as a system did not break with capitalism even when new economic policy ended. There were development of kind of financial markets preceding Underground that threatened the stability of the regime, or I guess the ideological facade that the regime presented, which was that socialism was being built or had been built. The analysis of Soviet money, I think, should require an understanding of different forms of assets, different forms of legality. If this could be a further topic of research down the line, then a specificity about what money we're talking about, which money supply, part of the money supply we're talking about. And although I didn't speak to it here, conflict in the Soviet system oriented around relations of kind of market exchange. And I should have said not simply production, which is when, workers are discontented and they complain to management. That also happens. I should have said not only production, but relations of exchange that are very important and don't ever go away, but generate a kind of anxiety and ultimately, what I argue in the dissertation, contribute in fact largely to the terror in 1937, which is an attempt to kind of get rid of this restoration of capitalism that's going on in the underground black securities markets that I analyzed. So that's kind of a lot, but yeah, I'm going to stop there and yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk. Yeah.
times for questions.
So thank you so much for this talk. It's really fascinating, and you've done this great kind of research on the specificities of particular trade in these bills of trade or whatever bills of sale. So I guess my question is really about the context in which you put it, right? So the context that you place this in is very much in the context of Stalinism and the is this what was going on in the Stalinist economy? But I've seen this kind of thing, and I'm just wondering, are you aware? So I've seen this type of thing reminds me of a lot of other contexts you could put this in, right? In particular, just how the Soviet economy worked in general, right? So there's been a lot of interesting studies of that relate to this, including Kornai's study of the socialist system, that offer really good explanations for what's going on here that are slightly different, and then also in the unraveling of communism. So like David Woodruff's book Money Unmade, I don't know if you know that, but it's kind of about how this type of when the money system falls apart, at the end of the Soviet Union, how this type of interfirm barter basically transactions start to occur. So I guess that's the main thing. I would just say that, from my perspective, what this shows is, again, that there's, the planning doesn't work that great, right? You get a bunch of inputs, you're supposed to have a bunch of outputs, but let's say you're missing like the key ingredient. It's kind of like when you're cooking. It's like, where's the salt? Gotta go get something from the store. So what it evolves is basically markets. I mean, the whole Soviet system was, at a lesser level, there were interfirm markets going on. You're talking about, I guess, one particular type of interfirm market. The other thing it seems like exceptional to me about your story is that, so you could fit pretty much this whole thing into that story, but what you're talking about is fraud, basically, like straight out fraud. And that seems to originate from a different source to me, which is basically from trying to trick the planners. Right, it's kind of a version of over-reporting. Yeah. Right, of sort of saying, well, we need to show that we have X amount of revenue to get X amount of inputs in the plan next time around. So we're just going to inflate everything, by saying that we have all this revenue we don't have. So I guess my question is really, are there these more general things going on? Why necessarily put it only in the context of the Stalin?
Could you try to repeat the question?
Yeah. So I guess the question being what is the economic context of this in a broader sense, and how it relates to the literature, let's say on planning and central system. So first of all, I am actually a huge fan of all that work that you're mentioning, Kornai, and there used to be in the 70s, I think, was the high point of a lot of these debates about whether the Soviet Union could be analyzed as a kind of actually according to sort of Western economic models. So like equilibrium, disequilibrium, whether it was generally ineffective. And I speak to all that in the dissertation. I think the reason I chose this approach for the talk was more so just because it felt like the simplest way to get at the thing. But you're absolutely correct that the planning side of it is actually important, and I don't want to discount it by saying, well, the plan simply didn't work, and so therefore people. In fact, there's an element to the story where the plan, the desire to make the plan work, or the desire to guarantee that the plan works for, say, the workers and the prices, so the prices remain stable. Because one thing that you have with this problem with inner firm markets, for example, or even just black markets is, let's say you are a worker and you trust the state to provide or certain prices for your wage, and you go to the store, obviously there's nothing there, so there's shortages. Well, one of the reasons why there's shortages isn't just because they're not making enough stuff. That's definitely there, and they're fraud, and there's people saying we have it, but we don't. But there's such a huge opportunity for you to go as a firm to the second market, to the black market, and just pawn it off there for a higher price, because you can create a contract, you can sort of negotiate, barter for something higher and get a loan or something. And so the prices on what even the sales department head calls Volnoy Rynek, it's like a free market, or like a, I don't know. Yeah. he says the prices we get there are much higher, and so we would rather just go there, and that's what we do, so we can get more cash. But you're a worker, you go there with your wage, and you're like, I can't pay these prices that the firms are. So in a way, you're having a bigger issue of like, well, people just start complaining that this is all, so people knew that this wasn't working even then, and were kind of complaining. And so the onus on the regime to go, we have to figure this out. It's not just like fraud and it's bad, but it's like this is a huge issue for the ideological guarantee that we're providing to the people. So aside from that, there's of course then the issue of what does that mean economically? That can mean a persistent disequilibrium between the prices and the total income of the workers. Maybe the prices are higher than the income that they get, and so they're like, we can't pay that price. So that speaks to some kind of a price wage disequilibrium that I also talk about, and that I hope to kind of conceptualize before the defense in an adequate enough way. But yes, to your question, I guess it's very complicated, but all of those things are in my mind, and I guess there could be a way to structure this talk where I actually put some of that back in, maybe, but I'll have to think about it. Yeah. Anyone? Yeah, please.
Well, thank you for your talk. This is fascinating, and this is something totally new to me. So my question is more kind of out of curiosity and kind of lack of awareness of that side of Soviet history. But do you know anything about these kind of shady, underhanded dealings in later decades, like in the 50s and the 60s? Is there any kind of dynamic as to like, does it flourish more during like thaw, or like how did it correlate with political development? Anything about like subsequent decades?
Yeah, so the question is, how does this underground market develop maybe after the war, the post-war decades? Absolutely. So there's two ways to answer that. One is by saying that, of course, there's this kind of cottage industry of works on corruption that people have sort of have contributed to from the 50s to, let's say, the 80s and even the 90s. Sort of bribes, patronage, black markets, all of the good stuff that we associate with abuse of office. But for the financial capital side of it, what I can say is there hasn't been that much work on that front, although I'm sure you can reread some of that early work and say, actually, this is part of what's going on here. The interesting thing I've found is the bank continues throwing out this same number into the later decades. So even in the 80s, I forget who's the minister of finance or who was the banking minister, in sort of 1989, 1990, it was saying, yeah, there is all this stuff happening. It's free trade, 5 billion. And they keep throwing out this number 5 billion like it hasn't changed since 1939. I would wonder how to get at that question statistically and also source-wise, but actually that would, of course, require a much more kind of concerted effort on my part to figure out how big this market gets. But since they're saying 5 billion, I'm assuming it's at least high enough to be a problem. But I think they don't take it as seriously in the 80s as they do in the 30s. And I wonder why that is too, because in the 30s, it's like a big deal. And in the 80s, it's like, it's, it's happening. So we'll just move on. And then I think that does play a role later on in some of that disintegration of the ruble zone and the financial control, because the Ghost Bank goes away, it's disbanded, and then you have the central bank of Russia and all these places. So yeah, I'd love to know more as well about that, but I think there's definitely a continuity all the way up.
So my question, in certain respect, is about the difference between value and price. So if you say that Stalinism was a kind of capitalism with Soviet characteristics, it also raises the question of the meaning of capitalism. And we can think of it, of course, as a system that produces in order to sell, that is paid in order to produce surplus value. Mm-hmm. So everything is driven not by fulfilling needs, but valorization of value, to add value to itself, as the definition of what capital means. So I'm wondering, what is the role here of surplus value in this system, right? Because as Mitchell was pointing out, much of this is fraud and inflation in order to show that I either fulfilled the plan or didn't fulfill the plan. But the value is actually not added. There's no surplus value, right? The surplus value can only be generated between the difference of the output and wages paid out to the workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in this kind of shadowy fraud, where is the surplus value, right? And if there is a market, but there is no surplus value, that would not be a sufficient condition to characterize it as capitalism of some sort, right? So I'm wondering on the role of the surplus value in this machination.
Right. So the question of definitions of capitalism, maybe what my operative definition is, and also how this sort of plays into that debate about how to define a system like this or any system like this. So interesting to your point about surplus. Obviously, this is a Marxist system based on Marx's works in some way. So the idea is that the surplus value has to equalize with the total prices. The surplus profit and surplus value have to somehow equalize. And so the regime promises in ways, when you read the bank documents or the planner documents, this is a part of the theme. It's like, it's a balanced growth. It's balanced in the sense that we know how much surplus we're going to extract from the workers and how much they're going to get back in the form of wages, and it's supposed to be circling. But when you have what Marx called fictitious capital, which is what he sort of uses that term to say capital, that's not really capital. That throws a spanner in the works, because it's where does that fit into this overall scheme? The bank itself, the reason why the bank worries, I can't necessarily say about the overall theory of what the capitalism that I study is, but the bank worries that the bank is a little bit hypocritical because it uses the Marxist framework to actually extract surplus. It's technically what it's doing is saying, well, there's something like an interest rate, a turnover tax is what they call it, налог с оборота. And so they would extract that from the enterprise or from the workers. Technically, it's supposed to be reinvested as surplus back into the economy. And so it's a perfect world. Everybody gets the. But if the money avoids the bank in some technical sense and the bank isn't getting the tax, then there's some kind of inequality and there's some kind of fraud, obviously, but also a kind of abuse of the whole system. So whether I kind of what I think about is whether Marx's own definition of capitalism is in some ways incomplete in addressing this kind of circuit, that there's a circuit going on, there's a monetary circuit, what he called circuit of money capital, but that this circuit of money capital can function without input of worker labor, right? In terms of like speculatively, it's just a speculative thing and it's running. But the workers are kind of a separate somewhere off, and the value that they produce is somewhere also, and it's being extracted, obviously, but to what end? How good is the quality of those goods? Do they get anything back for that? All of that sort of seems to speak to a kind of a lot of questions that I hope maybe probably further down the line I could solve, although they're big questions. But those are the questions that I hope to kind of start the conversation on, is how do we get these definitional questions going? So, yeah.
Can I just raise a question related to that? So the literature that you're speaking to kind of makes this attempt to sort of muddy the waters of the definition of capitalism, right? It essentially says, oh no, this is actually capitalism. And I think that that's a rhetorical trope that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, yes, markets, yes, other things, but not capitalism, right? And the reason I'd say that is that, capitalism is really defined by Marx and pretty much everybody after as control over the capital, right? So who owns the means of production, right? So here in this system, the state obviously owns the means of production. It delegates that to the directors of these enterprises, who are themselves Communist Party members, and they're only there by virtue of their membership in the party, not for some other reason. There aren't capitalists actually right now. So this can be seen probably as a deviation somehow from communism, right? But I don't think it's enough to warrant calling that, there's no capital formation, right? In your story, I don't see evidence of substantial capital formation that is being used to own something, right? It seems to me that what you're talking about is more bills of trade. That's more like an interfirm market, sort of transaction where it's like, we have stuff, you have stuff, we want to shift it around. So for that reason, I think I would just say that you have to think critically about what this literature is actually trying to say. I feel like they're trying to do it in a very sort of argumentative way, or as a sort of like it's interesting, but I just don't see how realistic it is. And I just wonder what your view of that is.
So, so my view on sort of the definitional question about
the literature you're speaking to, is it serious about calling this capitalist?
So I should say, and I should do a better job of this. The literature that I sort of analyze stops at 28. Well, I shouldn't say that. It analyzes different periods of Soviet history, but they don't make the argument that it's capitalist. I sort of just say that they analyze money, but I analyze it in a different way. I should have specified that it's kind of.
And Sigourney, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literature you said.
Yeah. So to get at the actual question of ownership, or the antidote to that, one of the interesting things about this system is that they have something called arbitration courts, which are little studied, but they exist. And I mentioned in the beginning that when you have real kind of bills are being traded, they're collateralized by something. So usually when people are taking the loan, they say, if I don't pay it back, you could take my cow. I don't know, something bland or whatever. But in the case of an enterprise, what can happen, and what does happen, is that there's a bit of I don't know if it's a double standard, but it's when something goes wrong, and it inevitably does. And I don't mean in the planning side. I mean the people that run the scheme. Someone is unhappy, and they go, "You screwed me over." So they might become a whistleblower or something, or they can go to arbitration court and go, he owes me some equipment because I paid him and he didn't pay me back. And so they go to arbitration. It's like a litigating thing, but whether they actually, whatever. So what happens is the managers start making claims on the equipment. This doesn't strike well with the bank because the bank has bought treasury bills from the treasury to finance long-term debt, kind of fictitiously, but that's a different chapter, to own this equipment. And so the bank goes, well, this is our equipment. This is literally we invested in that equipment. We've created our own fictitious capital and we've invested in that equipment. We're the state. And the managers go, well, our short-term debt has priority because we're doing the trades. And so now we own the equipment. And what ends up happening is the fixed capital of a plant the tussle starts happening between that, leading to the NKVD going, what the hell is going on? And coming in and basically starting to do the mass investigation, mass intelligence work on interfirm market in this time. So technically there is this tussle and a corporate governance problem. And the NKVD is supposedly the solution to that. Whether it is actually the solution, I don't think so. Because the NKVD comes in and basically gets rid of everybody and does the same thing. It goes, we'll give us the equipment and we'll use our forced labor to use it. And so we'll just make the surplus that way. You don't even have to pay them, which is even worse. It's not even capitalism or communism. It's something else. But that's my kind of antidote to that, is that there is an ownership problem, but it's also very ill-defined because the law doesn't have any articles based on how to deal with this issue. So everything gets wrapped up in enemies of the people, foreign subterfuge and stuff.
But they're all state firms, though.
Yeah, they are all technically state firms. Yeah, they're owned by the bank, or at least the bank has the lease. So yeah. Yep.
Could you say a couple words about the documents, the archives that are available? Are they still available? How much stuff is out there? What are the types of documents? Are there court records from the arbitration courts?
Yeah, so there's a huge swath of documents. The three main ones I used. First one was the central bank published These are published. They're not. I didn't go to the archive for these. These are sort of just document collections. There's about 18 or 19 of them online. That again, nobody looks at for different periods. So those are for the state bank, Gosbank. The stuff on the actual fraud or the trades is a lot of it I draw from local archives. So St. Petersburg Central Historical Archive, which I don't know the status of today. I try to access their website, and it's hard. I don't know what's going on with their website, but I don't know the status of all of that at this point. But this was all before that. This is the commissions of Soviet control, which are these investigative arms in the districts, and the casework on interrogations or interviews on. It's kind of actually similar to what used to happen here with immigrants, the Harvard Social System Project. There's like a bunch of interviews online. The Stalin was doing the same thing. He was interviewing people. They were interviewing people and trying to figure out what the hell they were doing. So that's in Petersburg and Moscow and different places. And the arbitration stuff is not here, but the arbitration records I have some from local places, like local archives. People owe this amount or that amount, and so a lot of them are in RGE, which is the economics archive in Moscow, the state one. Has some stuff. If you look at accounting books, they'll have arbitration stuff, but it'll be very vague. It'll be like they owe this amount, but we don't know what the court has decided yet. So I'm sure there are some somewhere, or they might have been burned. I don't know. But yeah, that's the.
Well, I might misunderstood, but are you saying that there is a direct connection between between the purges and these things going on, and was there an awareness of these things and the intention to
Yeah. So absolutely. So one of the kind of bigger, more controversial claims that I make is that the terror, in large respect, both the nomenclatura purge, the elite purge, and actually also the mass operations are connected to these inner firm markets. We need to repress these inner firm markets, and not even just repress them, but also expropriate them, extract the surplus that isn't there, but they want to get anyway, so that it goes into the national income and gets appropriated. So I'm arguing basically for the causal link, that there are, the NKVD knew about them. They were doing the investigations. People usually, when they look at surveillance, they'll go at what they call the svodki, like the population surveillance, so like the mood reports of the people, how people feel about stuff. But I look more at surveillance that's more targeted, like a domestic intelligence surveillance, working against spies, all this kind of counterintelligence stuff. And those are much more targeted, and they're much more about this. But of course, a lot of that, then the work that I had to do was to decrypt the language, because the language is transformed into Article 58, enemies of the people, Trotskyist, something. And then you go, what does that mean really? If this is, what is that? What does a certain scapegoat label mean in a certain market context? Like, does that mean a certain crime or a certain? And so then I have to figure out what each code means. So, for example, it could mean a certain nationality, right? There's obviously nationality operations, so they'll say Polish or German or whatever, and they'll say. But of course, a lot of Polish or German specialists, foreign specialists, or German, Polish people working in the factories, working with the bills. So they'll go German, Polish, but actually it's economic based too. So there's a confluence. So all that stuff I had to try to figure out. But that relates. I sort of kept it more, what is that called? Like no blood here. But there's a lot of blood that ends up being spilled because of that. So, yeah.
Sure, we have time for one more question.
So this isn't a question, but a comment. I just say that thinking back on your responses before, I think what's unique in my estimation about this, and I know more of the political science and economic literature than historical literature, but it seems like what's unique about what you have is that you're talking about capital markets existing under communism. Now, in general, people have known that markets exist under communism for a long time, but you're specifically focusing on capital markets under communism. And I think that in my recollection, there's much less about that. And so I think that's, to me, the thing that really stands out, kind of with this research.
Yeah, to that point, even the literature on, like, say, Gregory Grossman's second economy in the Soviet Union or in communism, even the Hungarian, I remember, I don't know if it was economics minister, but someone from the 60s was saying, we've always had markets. It's just we don't talk about it. But yes, you're right. In that the capital side of it, the ad hoc allocation of capital is something that I'm much more interested in. And so that's where I was going with that. It's absolutely.
Yeah, that's almost like, I think, a good title in a way, for some part of the project. But then I think the other thing that's interesting about it is when you do start talking about capital markets, it gets really messy, right? Because basically the state is really allocating the capital and has reasons to want to allocate capital. And so it's sort of, it becomes a game. Like I almost want to say, like, you could have a model, for how they're playing this game and who's playing the game. Because it's not actually entirely just the people intersecting themselves, but it's also they're playing a game with the banks and playing a game with the government. And those are the things that really upset the NKVD, because somebody else thinks that they own this stuff, right? And so these types of markets, I wonder if it's true that these types of markets were more repressed than other markets are having. Because I think my understanding is in socialist firms, nobody cared if you bought a bunch of steel inputs from somebody else. That was like they all had people that did that.
Yeah.
But it seems like the argument here is that because of what they're trading in this bills of sale, that may have subjected them to sort of repression. Is that the core claim?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that element of it, not so much, let's say, like the market for goods or resources, but the market for capital. Once it gets to the capital side and the bank is being defrauded and claims are being screwed up and things are becoming kind of hectic, that's when the NKVD really steps in. The smaller stuff, of course, matters, but and I don't mean smaller in like goods and resources.
Yeah, it could be bigger.
Could be bigger, actually, yeah. But it's the money part, actually, which is kind of weird when you think about the fact that a lot of literature says, well, you could just print more money, and the state bank is owned by the government, so you could just print more. But it becomes difficult with the planning side because the plan has to somehow make sense, and you have to find ways to make it appear. So it's like Pakazuka, like you have to make it appear like it actually does work. And at the same time, if people are having claims on ownership and stuff like that, that kind of goes against the whole thing. So, yeah.
That could be a little strong. Like, I wonder why that got them so riled up.
Well, I guess the short answer to that would be, it's an opportunity, really. It's not that I don't even think it's so much that it's not that the NKVD goes like, oh, we really care that the plan doesn't work. It's that it's a great opportunity for the NKVD to move in. Because when you have a gray area like that, a quasi-gray straight place, you can, under the guise of laws or no laws, go in, do what raiderski zakhvat, like a corporate raid. You take the people out, you take the management out, even take a lot of the workers out, and start to basically own in a quasi fashion, like, oh, I have gulag labor, so I'll subsidize. I have budgets, so put the firm on my budget, and I'll get the appropriation. It's like you have that in the 90s, you have that in the 2000s too. That kind of classic. Even now, I mean,
I feel like that's a better hook than saying the NKVD is capitalist.
Okay. I'm glad somebody said it before I said it, because then I can always say you were
Yeah, because like, I don't know. That's my. I'm just trying to think of the ways like
to sell in a way.
Well, yeah. What is unique? How do you? What are the hooks? What are the sort of like?
Yeah.
This. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
One final comment or question.
Yeah, the more I hear you speak about this, the more I'm realizing that what you're talking about is specifically what you mentioned briefly in your response, fictitious capital, right? You're drawing on Polanyi's three fictitious commodities, namely money, labor, land, right? These are not actual commodities. And what is being traded there in these shady markets is precisely the fictitious commodities that are not commodities in truth under capitalism. So this is quite interesting to kind of, maybe it's not capitalism with the Soviet characteristics, but fictitious capitalism that is the Soviet characteristics.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So it's specifically these commodities. There are no other commodities otherwise. I cannot locate any other commodities in specific capitalist sense anywhere there.
Well, I mean, this gets at the question also of counterfeit, right? Because in capitalism, this is also a recurrent issue of like, what counts as a fraud or a counterfeit, and I sort of don't ascribe to any particular definition of fictitious capital, although Polanyi or Marx or whoever, obviously there's a huge literature on it. But I guess to your point, it's interesting that the most interesting part for a lot of enterprises is like not the real stuff, but the stuff that's technically like made in the air, like kind of making money stuff, right? So that's also in a mentality sense, like what do they think? What is their value? What is their maybe subjective appreciation of value? Like what do they care about? Is another thing that I try to get at is that there are this sort of, you wouldn't call it materialism because it's technically fictitious, but it's like fetishist, a kind of valuing of certain stuff that doesn't,
Or maybe it's just an opportunity. Like you can't, if you're a wood factory and you need wood, you can't really make that up, but you can write whatever did out on this note and just create stuff. That seems like it's like kind of a good deal.
Yeah. Until the bank finds. Well, the bank even not in the bank finds the NKVD finds it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll stop there. Before we give another round of applause for Alex, I just want to say that we'll have a brief break we'll have our lunches here. We'll set it up. Please don't mob the table yet. And then we'll have lunch and we'll reconvene at 1:15. And so now let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much.